We live in a time that we think is very difficult for Christians and people of faith. We look around us and we see that God has been almost completely removed from our public institutions and our schools, and that the very mention of God, much less a prayer in such a place, might cause us to get arrested or fined. We look at honest, hardworking Christian businessmen and women who refuse to engage in practices that they feel violate their faith. And such people are not being applauded, they're being persecuted and forced out of business. I just read a story this morning about a business in Arizona that was forced to shut down after pressure from social media for putting signs in its windows saying that it believed in God and the Ten Commandments. And we look at these things and we wonder, what will happen to us? What will happen to our faith? What will happen to the church as we continue to become a minority in our own country? A country that was founded on the principles of Christianity and religious freedom. And now, we are a minority. We are quickly becoming a numerical minority. We are already a cultural minority. Simply one voice among many in the marketplace of ideas shouting for attention. Well, the church will survive, and faith will survive. The church and Christians have been through far, far worse in history than what we're going through right now. I'd like to read to you one of those situations from the 2nd century. It was a time when the Roman Empire was still very powerful, and Christianity was illegal, and people were having to worship underground and meet in secret. And if you were caught as a Christian, you were arrested and forced to renounce your faith. And if you renounced your faith, you were set free. If you didn't, you were imprisoned and brutally tortured and killed, all for the sake of spectacle and entertainment. This is a story from 177 AD. This is a historical account of a man named Sanctus in the Lyon area of what is now France. Sanctus also endured marvelously and superhumanly all the outrages which he suffered. While the wicked men hoped by the continuance and severity of his tortures to wring something from him, which he ought not to say, he girded himself against them with such firmness that he would not even tell his name, but answered in the Roman tongue to all their questions, "I am a Christian." He confessed this instead of name and city and race and everything besides, and the people heard from him no other word. There arose therefore on the part of the governor and his tormentors a great desire to conquer him, but having nothing more that they could do to him, they finally fastened red-hot brazen plates to the most tender parts of his body. And these indeed were burned, but he continued unbending and unyielding, firm in his confession, and refreshed and strengthened by the heavenly fountain of the water of life flowing from Christ. And his body was a witness of his suffering, being one complete wound and bruise, drawn out of shape, and altogether unlike a human form. Christ, suffering in him, manifested his glory, delivering him from his adversary, and making him an example for the others, showing that nothing is fearful where the love of the Father is, and nothing is painful where there is the glory of Christ. I don't know about you, but when I read something like that, and by the way, there are many, many other examples, and people who had much worse done to them. But when I read that, I think two things. One of which is, we don't have it so bad here after all. But the other thing I think is, how? How in the world could someone endure that? Torture and punishment and death. Not only endure it, but embrace it. If you read the stories of other martyrs from that time period, they willingly went to the beasts and to the spear and to the sword. They believed that suffering in such a manner connected them to the suffering of Christ. And they believed it made them worthy to wear the crown of life. How in the world could anyone do that? The answer, I think, at least partially, is in our epistle reading this morning, where Paul talks about the peace of God that passes all understanding. They were filled with a peace of God by trusting fully in God, by having faith in God, by believing and putting their whole lives and faith in His hands, despite their outward circumstance. And that's what gave them a peace that the world could not understand and will never understand. The tormentors couldn't figure out why they couldn't get people to confess. They could not understand why they couldn't break someone. The world will never understand because it doesn't have that peace. And when you don't have that peace, when you don't trust God, when you decide to go off on your own, it usually leads to difficult, dangerous, and bad situations. We saw that in our Old Testament lesson this morning. Now think of what's going on here. The Jews have been in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. They prayed to God for deliverance. They prayed and they prayed and they prayed and they prayed. And finally, God sent Moses. And Moses showed all these incredible miracles from God. The blood of the Nile, the locusts, the frogs, the hail, finally the death of the firstborn. They saw all these things. So now they're released. They're free. The Egyptians come chasing after them. What does God do? He protects them with a pillar and a cloud. And then when they're backed up against the Red Sea, nowhere to go, God miraculously parts the waters, allowing the Israelites to cross and drowning the Egyptians. They saw all of this. And what happens when Moses gets up on the mountain and gets delayed for a few minutes? No trust, no peace. They didn't have that peace. They decided God needed help. God had abandoned them. After seeing all of this, they decided that God had forsaken them. So they made the golden calf with disastrous consequences for them. It's not unlike the situation we see in Genesis, where God promises a son to Abraham and Sarah, even though they're very old. See, they didn't trust either. They didn't have that peace. They decided, God needs our help. We do that too, don't we? If God only knew what I was going through, He'd know that He needs my help. So they decided to help God. Abraham fathered a child from Hagar, Sarah's servant. And that child grew up to be Ishmael, the spiritual father of the Muslim nation. And we are still paying for that mistake 5,000 years later. The peace of God. Contrast that to someone who has that peace, who trusts in God, who commits their life to Him fully despite everything going on. Mary, the mother of Jesus. Now think about that for a minute. The angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, Mary, I bring you good news. You're going to be the mother of the Christ. Mary is unmarried. She's a teenager, probably 13 or 14 years old. And back then, you were an unmarried, pregnant teenager, you did not get a reality show. You got stoned. You got killed. And Mary knew this. By all accounts, the world would have understood if Mary had said, nope, don't want it, can't do it, I think you need to find somebody else. Instead, what did she say? I am the Lord's servant. Let it be to me as you have said. That is someone with peace. That is someone with faith. That is someone with the assurance that no matter what, God is there. He's in control. He's not going to let us fall. That He is always going to be there for us. In a few moments, we're going to sing a song, one of my favorites. It is Well With My Soul. That song was written by a man named Horatio Spafford, and I don't know if you know the story behind that song. Horatio Spafford was from England. He emigrated to the United States in the 19th century. He sent his family back, his wife and daughters, on a ship. He was going to join them later on another ship, just for a visit. The first ship with the wife and daughters ran into a storm, was capsized, and the family died. Horatio Spafford went back across the ocean in another ship to collect the bodies, if possible, and to bury them. And when he was at the exact spot where that accident, where the storm took place, he was told, this is where it happened. And that's when he sat down and wrote, "It is well with my soul." He had lost, seemingly by the world's estimation, everything. But he knew he had that peace. God was in control. It was well with his soul. Peace. We chase after it. We think about it constantly. Will we ever have peace in the Middle East? Will we ever have peace in Korea? Will we ever have peace in our streets which have exploded in violence? That's peace as the world knows it. God gives us something different, something better. If we trust and obey and live lives of faith, God truly, in the midst of all those storms, all those difficulties, all those roads God asks us to walk down, God will give us a peace that passes all understanding. Amen.